liberal wing of the church, they view it as myth. Again, a nice story, a useful story, useful principles, and things that deal with spiritual things, but again, mythological, not historical, not real, and again, not related to science. Just a representative quote, and you can find many of these from the writings of these liberals. This is from one book by Page and Moore. They say, "We cannot force the ancient writer to follow our own 20th century canons of historical writing." In other words, don't expect Genesis 1 to display the elements that you would expect from a historical work. That's a little summary of what he has to say, and if you read further, he expands what he means in that short quote. I didn't want to give you a full quote because you wouldn't be able to read it. So the world, or the unbeliever, sees Genesis 1 irrelevant. A portion of Christendom, liberal Christianity, sees it mythical. And there's another segment of Christianity that wants to be a little bit closer to holding to Genesis 1. But again, they would see it as somewhat poetical, not literal, not historical, with elements of poetry. The support that they use for that, they would say that symmetry that I told you about and that clear-cut symmetrical structure of each of the days. In other words, the dividing of the 6 days into 2 parts, that symmetry, that balance argues for poetry. And then the clear structure that seems to be the repetition in the 6 days, that argues for poetical ideas. So that would be what they would use to support it. But against that is those are certainly elements of English poetry, but those are not necessarily the elements of Hebrew poetry. Hebrew poetry is different from English poetry. Does anybody remember, do you know what the primary feature, the primary characteristic of Hebrew poetry? Some of you would know that. Parallelism. And there's very little parallelism in Genesis chapter 1. And you would anticipate, you would expect, if this was poetic, you would expect parallelism that you would find very clearly in poetic passages. That is the major feature. Another major feature is the use of metaphorical language, and there doesn't appear to be an abundance of metaphorical language in Genesis 1. It seems to be straightforward. You have to read into the text ideas that really are not there. So Hebrew poetry, the main characteristic would be the parallelism. The examples, if you read the Psalms, you have synonymous parallelism, very common, where you have one line states one idea, and then the next line, if you've noticed, it's almost the same idea, just in different words. Or you have antithetical parallelism, like in the book of Proverbs. In Proverbs, you have contrast. That's antithetical, where one statement is made and then the opposite statement is made. You don't have any of that in Genesis chapter 1. So it doesn't have the characteristic of Hebrew poetry. Instead, it has all of the characteristics of true historical narrative. So that's the final option, and that's the viewpoint. Well, there's another one which is somewhat unique. Bruce Waltke, and I even hate to mention his name because he's such a tremendous scholar, and I don't want to diminish him in any way. If I even had 1/10 of his scholarship and abilities in Hebrew, I would be very, very happy. Tremendous scholar. The unfortunate thing, in fact, the only thing that I've really detected in that I would criticize would be his reliance too much on science to influence his interpretation of Genesis 1. So he's come up with this unique creation genre, which is certainly unique to Genesis 1 and to creation materials outside of the Bible. But we would hold to historical narrative. In other words, what is written here was intended to be written in such a way that these things actually happened. And these things took place in time. Historical narrative. And took place in space and dealing with events on Earth primarily. And many scholars support this idea, those that are conservative. Umberto Cassuto, a well-known Hebrew scholar, says the following: Israel has the distinction of being the first of the civilized peoples to create historiography. In other words, the Hebrews, or the Jewish people, were very unique in their writings. They're the first people that have displayed this characteristic of historical narrative. Most of the other people write epics, stories that are legendary and not historical. He goes on, in the full and precise meaning of the word. In other words, this is history. This is real history. Much like what we could write today. Other writers, in fact, I've got some other quotes I'd like to read to you. Alan Ross, another Hebrew scholar, he says, reality in the Old Testament differs radically from the prevailing view of the ancient world. In other words, their viewpoint of reality or history or science is radically different. He goes on. The Hebrews believed in an absolutely sovereign God who brought them into existence as a nation. The narratives are timeless as well as being centered in time, but they are not myth. And he would argue for the historicity of Genesis 1 as well as the rest of historical narrative. Another interesting quote by James Barr, who's not, I'm not sure, he's a liberal. I'm not sure if he's born again. I don't know if he's a believer. But he's a Hebrew scholar, and he's familiar with the other scholars. He says the following. He's one of the leading Hebrew scholars. He says, probably so far as I know, there is no professor of Hebrew, of Old Testament, at any world-class university who does not believe that the writers of Genesis 1 through 11 intended to convey to their readers, the idea that, 1, creation took place in a series of 6 days, which were the same as the days of 24 hours we now experience. 2, the figures contained in the Genesis genealogies provide by simple addition a chronology from the beginning of the world to the later stages in the biblical story. And then he goes on and lists other things touching on the Genesis flood and other issues. And what he's basically saying is all of the world-class Hebrew scholars acknowledge that this was the intention of the writers. Now, some of those same scholars would take the next step and say, yeah, but they're wrong. In other words, they're inaccurate. They thought they were conveying this, and they were writing, in other words, Moses was writing such that he believed that God created in 6 days. But in our enlightened age and what we know from science, we know that that cannot be the case. That would be the argument. But they would acknowledge that that was at least the intent. So that's a revealing quote. So, narrative is a presentation of history or events in story form. That's basic narrative. And by the way, one of the most prominent literary genres of all of the Bible is, in fact, historical narrative. It's most common. About 40% of the Old Testament is historical narrative. And a large portion of the New Testament is historical narrative, the Gospels and the book of Acts. So, it's very common. So we know the characteristics of historical narrative, and those characteristics are contained in Genesis chapter 1. Well, what's some more evidence? Well, some textual evidence. I've already alluded to this vav consecutive, so let's look at it a little bit more carefully. The significance of a vav consecutive in Hebrew, generally it will introduce a past time narrative sequence. In other words, a sequence of events. In other words, when it has the and, it follows some event, and then now you have a another event or series events. And then it goes on and on into the different events. The form of it, which is contained, you have several of them in Genesis chapter 1. You have that vav, which is the Hebrew letter, translated as and in English, plus a preterite or a past tense verb. Very characteristic, and there's some other characteristics of it as well. I don't want to distract you with some of those details. If you look at your text, let's look at some of the vav consecutives, and you might see. So what you expect in the Hebrew text, you have the vav connected to that verb. Now in the English, it inserts the noun, because in English we put the noun before the verb. But the noun would come after, and generally the noun is God himself. So when it says, for example, go back to verse 3, we have the very first vav consecutive. It doesn't begin in verse 2. I think I mentioned that when we went through verse 2 in our first session. That's a vav. There's a vav there, but it's vav disjunctive, and it's not attached to the verb. It's attached to the noun. So it doesn't have the characteristics of vav consecutive. In verse 3, and said would be the literal Hebrew, God. And said God. But, we don't speak that way, so it's translated, and God said. And in the verb, you have reference to the noun, obviously. So it would be concord with the noun. So, and God said. Verse 4, again, and God saw. Vav consecutive. Also, and God separated. And you can go through. Verse 5, we have the one that I mentioned, and God said again. Verse 6, then God said, still vav, even though it's translated then. Verse 8, and God called. God called. Verse 9, then God said again. Verse 10, and God called. Then there's a second one in verse 10, and God saw again. Verse 11, verse 12, verse 14, verse 16, verse 17. You can go through Genesis chapter 1, which is telling us these are past-time narrative sequential events. God did this, then he did this, then he did that, and then he did this, all the way through Genesis 1. That's a major characteristic of historical narrative. Now, some of you, in fact, many of you have probably read the last chapter in Thousands, Not Billions, the popular version of the research that the RATE group did. The last chapter there by Stephen Boyd, he did a statistical analysis of Genesis chapter 1 and compared it with poetic materials. And he looked particularly for the verbs which were more prominent in the two types of literature, and I'll recommend that to you. So he looks at the finite verbs, and in poetic material you observe, and he has several passages that he used to test this with, using computers as well. Poetic material tends to utilize finite verbs that are in the imperfect in the Hebrew and perfects. Not necessarily so in narrative material. Narrative material, you have preterite finite verbs. And he comes up with these ratios, percentages, to kind of illustrate mathematically or technically that you can just tell by counting them and doing a statistical analysis.